And everyone, Scott Seaver's back. We just finished our first lecture on jihadism with Faraj in his book, The Neglected Duty. And now we're going to go to a name that you're all familiar with, Osama bin Laden, and look at uh, bring jihadism more or less up to date because spin-offs of Al Qaeda are kind of brings us to the present. So, first, a little background on bin Laden. Um, his home country was Saudi Arabia. His parents were from other places, but um, his home country was Saudi Arabia. His family was extremely wealthy. He was extremely wealthy, millionaire, if not billionaire, from the success of their family construction business. They had a big construction business and a lot of big, like really big construction projects in Saudi Arabia were done by the Bin Laden family, which I think continues in their in that work. They mostly disowned Bin Laden, but the religious context, as your editors pointed out in the introductory material, is Wahhabism, which is a very conservative brand of Islam championed by this guy Muhammad ibn Abd al Wahhab, right? He was a Hanbali scholar. Hanbali, remember Hanbal, the Hanbal um, Sunni legal school was a super conservative uh, school of Sharia, right? So Wahhab was a Hanbali scholar and a big admirer of that guy Ibn Taymiyyah, which jihadists often point back to as giving the basic justification for um, naming so-called Muslims kufr infidels, right, and naming governments that as well, and uh, fighting against them. This guy Wahhab, this is back in the 1700s, so a while back. Wahhab was this religious reformer, a you could call him a kind of Islamic Puritan. He was, leading a purification movement to get back to supposedly pure version of Islam, and he joined forces with this guy Muhammad ibn Saud. Uh, um, Back in that period, they made a pact, and Saud, of course, was the founder of the political entity that would later become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, today's Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That's the official name for it, the kingdom. And it involves a king, right, and a royal family. Um, so, um, the Saud and the Saud family were early on connected with this very hyper conservative version of Islam. They don't call themselves Wahhabis. That's what others have called them because it's a handy way of remembering. It's the version of this guy Wahhab. Um, but um, but what was I going to say? Part of the nature of this relationship between Wahhab and Saud was in the beginning, and still today, it's the same kind of relationship between Wahhabi religious authorities and the regime. From the perspective of Saud, his relationship with Wahhab was beneficial in terms of giving him legitimacy. He could have a religious legitimacy, right? That would help him in his political status. Um, and meanwhile, Wahhab, the benefit he got from the relationship was protection from Saud and his family, right? And still today, the Saudi regime is, um, in many ways, not sort of operating in line with the Wahhabi vision, right? I mean, you see these Saudi royal princes and other people in the family parading around with all this bling bling, golden rings and stuff like that. don't seem to be living what you'd call the pure, simple uh, Muslim lifestyle that Wahhabism would call for. And so there's always been a tension between the regime and the religious leadership, and um, and the way that the Saudi family has dealt with that problem is to more or less buy off the religious leadership by giving them what they want, right? So you continue to give us legitimacy, we'll continue to give you what you want. And this has primarily meant, in the modern context, Saudi funding of religious schools called madrasas, Madrassas, the English spelling. The madrasas are these religious schools focusing on learning the Quran, but they're run by these super conservative Wahhabis, and not only have they funded these schools and other activities of Wahhabi religious leaders in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but they've also exported this around the world. They funded uh, madrasas around the world. And one of the results of this is that the version of Islam that we often see in public, the face of Islam that we often see, is more or less the Wahhabi version. So, and this is a fairly recent development. So, the picture we have of Islam is heavily impacted by Wahhabism. I mean we, outside the Muslim world and inside the Muslim world too. This idea that this is what Islam looks like is heavily a result of um, this pushing of Wahhabism around the world. The relationship, in terms of the relationship of Wahhabism and Islamism, um, a lot of Islamists see Wahhabism as the version of Islam closest to their vision of what Islam is supposed to be, right? So you have the Wahhabis sort of inspiring this certain kind of approach, hyper-conservative approach to Islam. And a lot, I should clarify, and I've been to Saudi Arabia, and I've met people who adhere to Wahhabism, and they're not all radicals, and they're not all violent. They don't all subscribe to radical Islamism. Um, this is a traditional faith. A lot of them are fundamentalist in the older, the traditional sense of not particularly political. They just have this conservative version of Islam, and many of them are very nice and warm, loving people. So we shouldn't think that all Wahhabis, are in this sort of radical category, even if they are, very conservative. So, but conservative, I mean, for example, women, wear veils in public and long uh, robes that cover their figures, things like that. Recently, they've actually allowed women not to do that, and other freedoms for women. But from what I saw in Riyadh, which is the big city, and therefore where you would expect maybe people to be a little more, a little less conservative, and in the countryside, almost every woman was wearing the veil and so forth. It's not clear how many of them are doing that because that is, because they believe that's appropriate for modesty and so forth, or because their husbands, demand that, or because they don't know whether the sort of word from on high, from the regime, is going to stick to that. They also know that there are hardcore Wahhabis in the kingdom, including radical Islamists who who really hate this, and so they may be worried for their safety as well. In terms of education, Bin Laden studied at King Abdul Aziz University in Jeddah, which is one of the big cities. Um, and I've been there and met some professors who seem very friendly to the West, who are Western educated. Um, and this was probably plenty of that at the time that bin Laden was there. But there had been some radical members of the Muslim Brotherhood who immigrated over to Saudi Arabia after Nasser's crackdown and so forth to put Syed Qutb in jail. And some of them came, uh, some, some of the intellectuals came and taught um, at this university, King Abdul Aziz University. And I don't know that they were seen to be radical, they were recognized, but Syed Qutb's brother, Muhammad Qutb, was one of the people there, and this other guy, Azam Abd Allah Yusuf Mustafa Azam, um, who was important for bin Laden. They were both there. He studied under them, right? And Azam gave him a direct connection to what was going on in Afghanistan. I told you before, the Soviet-Afghan War was a pivotal event for bin Laden. He was one of these so-called Arab Afghans, a lot of people from the Middle East, Arabs who had come over to join the Mujahideen, the jihad fighters, who were trying to push the Soviets back out after they invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And bin Laden worked with Azam for his Al-Khidamat, his services center, which basically recruited Mujahideen from outside to come join the fight against the Soviets and raised funds for these purposes and so forth. And of course, bin Laden was a rich guy, and with lots of connections to other rich people, and so he did a lot in terms of the fundraising as well as the recruitment. And it's in this time that that bin Laden founded Al Qaeda. Means the base, basically the way your editors put it, it's very nice nutshell formulation. It was a formalized network of mujahideen. So they're trying to create a network of mujahideen all over the world, right, to carry the fight against the infidel aggressors beyond Afghanistan. And it's here that bin Laden begins to get this conception that we need to attack the far enemy first, or at least now, right? It's so here you had the socialist imperialist power, and then after the Soviets withdrew, the view of a lot of these mujahideen was that we Muslims defeated the Soviet Union. We committed Muslims defeated one of the superpowers, right? Overcame a long legacy. I think these are bin Laden's words. Reversed a long legacy of Muslim defeats and humiliations. So you remember we talked about this before. This sort of long decline of Islamic civilization relative to the West, which you can trace back to early modern times, not too long after early modern times, notably the defeat of the Ottomans in their second siege of Vienna, after which they suffered defeat after defeat militarily, and then eventually Western imperialism dominating the Muslim world and so forth. So bin Laden thinks this is a real turning point, and we've just defeated one of the great superpowers. And never mind that the United States funded and provided weapons for a lot of these fighters, right? Probably not. Probably bin Laden and his group, which were kind of off to the side, We're not direct recipients of this, but anyway, at any rate, we certainly didn't conceive that we might be contributing to people who would fight against us at some point. Realistically, the United States had a big role in defeating the Soviets here, but in their minds, Islam had just defeated one of the godless superpowers. And bin Laden began to think, well, one down, one to go. Right? There's two superpowers controlling the world. There's the Soviet Union, there's the United States, and this is the beginning. This is just the beginning. So, in relation to Al Qaeda, there are several innovations of bin Laden. I mean, they weren't theoretical. He was not an original thinker. He was not really a thinker per se, like like Azam and Zawahiri, who was one of his partners, who's now, I think, as far as I know, still alive and still at the head of Al Qaeda Central. It's all these franchises of Al Qaeda. Talk about that momentarily, but he was innovative in some ways. And I'll quote your editors again here because I think this is an excellent sort of nutshell summation. They put his innovations in terms of, quote, global jihad. That's the basic innovation, making jihad global as opposed to fighting these corrupt, tyrannical Muslim and name-only regimes. Right? Global jihad that in effect collapses the several distinctions between national and transnational, offensive and defensive war, near enemy and far enemy. Okay, so let me take each one of those. In terms of collapsing the distinction between national and transnational, bin Laden presents the problems of Muslims all over the world as interconnected, right? They're all part of a worldwide crusade, and that term crusade had resonance in terms of, ancient history of Western imperialists with the assistance of from these corrupt regimes in the Muslim world, right? So-called Muslims, and so it was all one big battle, right? It wasn't things happening in Egypt, things happening with the Chechens and in Russia. It was all part of one conflict, right? So he that's what it means by he sort of eliminates the distinction between national and transnational. In terms of offensive and defensive jihad, he conceives of this global jihad in terms of a war of self-defense. I mean, it's the Western imperialists. They've been transgressing against us, being aggressors, oppressing us for a long time. Now we're just fighting back, right? So it's a defensive warfare, and that's how Cutter talked about it. He said, well, let's all this sort of weak, mamby-pamby defensive warfare stuff. You got that from the Western thinkers, but we don't need a justification of defensive warfare. But then Cutter went on to say, well, there's one way you can look at it as defensive if you're saying that the whole Muslim world is under threat from Jahiliyyah, right? Then yes, it is a defensive war. And that's exactly the way bin Laden is thinking about it, right? And this is key, this obliteration of the distinction between offensive and defensive warfare is key to the justification for terrorism, because the idea is that none of those people are innocent. Right? The whole Western world and all of these so-called Muslim regimes and so forth, they're all guilty, right? And therefore they're all fair game, right? So that's the way he presents it. We're not really attacking civilians, right? Innocent civilians. They're all supporters of these aggressive regimes, and this is sometimes bolstered in the arguments by the people saying, well, these are these Western regimes are democratic regimes, and so the leaders who are doing all this stuff are elected by the people Therefore, the people are as guilty as anybody else, right? So anyway, and then this you know obliterating the distinction between near and far enemies, right? Contra Farage, who says we must attack the near enemy first. Um, Bin Laden, like Trotsky with his international permanent revolution, we got to attack on all fronts, and above all, the far enemy because they're the real power, right? Um, and then last bit of background is there's a series of terrorist attacks um, going on for a while before 9/11. I mean, it wasn't until 9/11 that Bin Laden became well known to the general public. But U.S. intelligence and other people dealing with these kinds of issues were aware that he was a problem, and and there were actually opportunities where they thought about taking him out, killing Bin Laden, but held back. There were a bunch of attacks, including two major attacks in Saudi Arabia, which has undergone a lot of terrorist attacks, continue to undergo a lot of terrorist attacks by Al Qaeda spinoffs like ISIS. Um, but so the Khobar Towers, I saw Khobar. I was in the area, um, and in Riyadh, where I also was when I visited Saudi Arabia. Um, there was an attack on this National Guard building. Khobar Towers had U.S. personnel in them as well, so that was part of the reason these targets were selected. And then most closest, the one unless I'm forgetting something, the attack that was closest to the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001 was an attack on the USS Cole, a U.S. naval ship, and they blew a big hole in the side of the ship and killed, I think, 17 Americans. So there had been stuff going on, but at this point, it seemed mainly a nuisance. The guy's dangerous. Had no idea something as big as 9/11 was in the works. Anyway, what you read here, there's another important. What you read here is in your reader, the Declaration of War against Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. A long title, but is one of a couple of famous fatwas of Bin Laden's. Fatwas, Fatwa. Fatwa is a kind of religious religious position on some event that's going on, some moral issue or something, um, and it's supposed to presuppose, authorized religious scholars do this, and so generally in the Muslim world, this was not. Bin Laden would not have been thought to have the authority to issue fatwas, right? But this was one of them, and there was another one. I forget the exact title of it, but in the other one, um, there was a statement: "Kill Americans wherever you find them." So we ratcheted up a bit more. But these were issued before 9/11, and it's one of the reasons why um, our intelligence people and others were concerned about Bin Laden because he did seem to have big aspirations. But anyway, this land of the two holy places is Saudi Arabia, right? The two holy places are Mecca and Medina. They're in Saudi Arabia. He's careful not to call it Saudi Arabia because he doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the Saudi regime, right? It's just kind of Arabia or the land of the two holy places. And then this Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. This occupation is what he has in mind is these U.S. troops who are stationed there, based there in Saudi Arabia, originally at the request of the Saudi regime. Right. Originally, as a base of operations for U.S. forces to um, to fight against Saddam Hussein in 1991 when he went in and invaded Kuwait. So we wanted to push him out of Kuwait, and we needed a base of operations. Right, Saudi Arabia is one of them, and so they invited, they accepted our request basically to use Saudi territory as base of operations, and then they invited us to stay for protection because there's things like Bin Laden going on, but anyway, that's what he's talking about in the title. You notice he mentioned several inspirations, including Taymiyyah, that medieval jurist Ibn Taymiyyah, Azam, who he had studied under, and one name you might not recognize, Umar Abd al-Rahman, Rahman, so-called blind sheikh. And he was a guy, you may not even know about this, but in 1993, the World Trade Center was attacked well before the 2001 attacks. This was a truck bomb, and al-Rahman was behind this first attack. They're kind of testing the waters, and that attack, the damage it caused, sort of awoke some of these jihadists to the fact that some of these big potential targets in New York City and other places are pretty vulnerable. I mean, they're not pretty well protected and so forth. So anyway, there was a previous attack on the World Trade Center towers, and the first one was by this headed up. He's blind, right? So he wasn't involved in the attack, but he was kind of a leader behind it. He's in prison now, U.S. prison. Bin Laden also mentions a revival. He talks about the Blessed Awakening, which is sweeping the world in general and the Islamic world in particular. And this is something to keep in mind. I mean, in recent decades, starting I think about in the 1970s, there has been a explosion is the right word, but a huge surge of religious belief, not only in the Muslim world, but the Christian world, among Jews. Big revivals. It's not the wrong word necessarily for this development. Not only has Islam been growing, but Christianity has been growing, and Judaism has been growing. We don't hear about the Christianity so much because it's not in the northern hemisphere. In Europe, Christianity's been in decline for a long time, but in Latin and South America, in Africa, and South Korea, and even in China, Christianity has been growing. And so he's right about this. There's a worldwide revival going on, and this is happening in the Muslim world. Most of it is not this kind of radical version, although a lot of it is very conservative, what we might call puritanical, but not exclusively that. I mean, there's this religious movement, various religious movements around the world, and there's a great book about this by a guy named Capel, Kepel, who's a French expert on jihadism. And he wrote a book called The Revenge of God, which talks about this explosion of religious belief around the world and practice. And he attributes it to dissatisfaction with the promises of modernity, that people, the promises of modernization were huge. Like everything in life would improve, and we'll be happier and so forth. But the reality seemed to be that, we have more creature comforts and all this, but we don't seem happier. We seem, empty, and a sense of spiritual emptiness is, seem to be driving a lot of this. Anyway, so that's useful for thinking about the larger context, what's going on. Another useful way to look at the larger context globally is in terms of what was said by a political scientist named Samuel Huntington in a book called The Clash of Civilizations. You may have heard of it. Um, Basically, uh, he was trying to conceive of how we should look at the geopolitical configuration of things after the fall of the Soviet Union. And his basic thesis was that under the Soviet Union, you had two great superpowers, right? And they were basically ideologically oriented. There was Western liberal democracy versus socialism, Soviet-style socialism, and all of the regimes of the world were basically had to ally themselves with one or the other, um, either by choice or just by necessity, worried about self-preservation. Um, but the power configuration of the world was bipolar. He called it. Right, there were two centers of power, and everything else was sort of clustered around those. But he said after the fall of the Soviet Union, you only have one superpower, and um, and no sort of dominating ideological framework. I mean, you could say that the liberal democracy is the most successful, but but everybody didn't suddenly become liberal democratic. And Huntington conceived of the world as the power structure of the world is now falling down along what he called civilizational lines, or you could say cultural lines. But um, the way he conceived it was that these ideological superpowers were sort of suppressing old identities, um, and and once that those suppressive powers were released, all these old identities started to be reasserted. So, you know, Chinese reasserted Chinese identity, Russians reasserted Russian identity, Muslims reasserted Muslim identity, and so Islamism is, in this analysis, is related to the breakdown of dominating ideologies, right? Um, so Islamism is one form of reassertion of Muslim identity. Um, of course, there's an element in this, as in all of these things, of conspiracy theorizing. This is a common resort of um, people who are relatively weak in certain contexts, right? When they feel they can't do anything, they tend to resort to conspiracies. Why are we having a hard time? It's because there are evil machinations at work behind the scenes and so forth. And Bin Laden brings this up a couple of times in this declaration of war against Americans. A couple of quotes. One place he says, "There's a clear conspiracy between the United States and its allies under the cover of the iniquitous United Nations." So, conspiracy against Muslims, the Muslim world. Another place he says, "Dividing the land of the two holy places has been an essential goal of the Zionist Crusader Alliance." Zionist refers to Israel, Jews, and Crusader refers to, he's speaking about Christian nations, but Western nations, traditionally Christian nations at least. And he likes this phrase, he uses it a lot, the Zionist Crusader Alliance. Which is handy, it's always handy in light of the modern problem of anti-Semitism in much of the Muslim world, especially in the Middle East, to tie, their enemies to the Jews somehow. Intensifies the feeling of outrage or whatever. But yeah, this conspiracy theorizing is going on, and a lot of people in the West, would just find themselves confused with. And after 9/11, a lot of people were saying, "What? Where did that come from? What have we done to you? You know, I did. Why do they hate us? Was one of the things that they kept saying. And you know, from a Western perspective, from a U.S. perspective, um, the attitude towards the Muslim world was not really one of hostility, but of ignorance and neglect. I mean, you know, most Americans didn't think about what's going on in the Muslim world. We're not really much aware of what's going on in the Muslim world. That was part of the problem from our part. um, but you know, a lot of us were like, "What do you mean we have a goal of, you know, dividing up your land and dominating you?" I mean, I haven't been thinking about you at all. But that's the way he's presenting this, and it had for, from the perspective of people who, you know, had experienced Western imperialism, and and really their lives were totally, you know, pervasively affected by Western culture. I mean, TV and technology and everything. I mean, it was everywhere. You couldn't get away from it if you wanted to. So, you know, it's sort of fertile ground for this kind of conspiracy theorizing. Of course, another feature of this that's common is, you know, he kind of gives a list of grievances, um, and the more he did these fatwas and public announcements, I mean, the bigger the list would get, you know, and he would just collect problems that were going around the Muslim world and sort of include that in. But here he's primarily focused on the Saudi regime, right, which he pronounces kufr. I mean, he uses the term infidel, but he says the Saudi regime is non-Muslim, right? It's kufr, because it invited uh, these infidels into the land of the two holy places and kept them here. And you know, this is kind of a sacrilege. It's kind of blasphemous. They're polluting the holy land, right? Um, and yeah, so you know, so the Saudi regime is enabling this and accommodating this and so on. And again, there's all the things happening around the world um, tied into this list of grievances. Um, the critical issue, no, Bin Laden says, the critical issue is, quote, the unification of the people under the divine law of Allah, unquote. In other words, what that means is what we've been talking about, the Islamic State. That's the critical issue, establishing an Islamic State. One interesting difference between Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, early Al-Qaeda, to groups like ISIS, is Bin Laden, like Qaeda, thought of establishment of Islamic states and the growth of that phenomenon around the world was a long-range project. Now, really, the focus is jihad. It's not realistic. It's not practical for us right now to try to establish Islamic states. So when the group now calls itself the Islamic State tried to establish a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, that area, and actually took over a lot of territory, right, for a time, the size of England, I think, a big chunk of territory. When they did this, people like Bin Laden thought that they were jumping the gun. They could not sustain this, and indeed they were not able to sustain it. But but the question was only, you know, when. It wasn't if. The goal was Islamic State, ultimately. That's what was at stake. Bin Laden, like Farage, talks about the duty to expel the enemy, the greatest kufr he talks about in the United States, the greatest infidel. To expel the infidel, the greatest kufr, out of the country, I'm quoting, is a primary duty, and no obligation other than belief is more important. So more important than anything except being Muslim itself is getting that guy out. And there's another quote that your editors bring out in their introduction It's even more striking is a quote where bin Laden says, "Nothing is more sacred than belief except repulsing an enemy who is attacking religion and life." In other words, in that quote, expelling the enemy is even more important than belief. Um, but what this means is jihad in the path of Allah, as he puts it. This is common phraseology, jihad in the path of Allah, to serve, Allah's cause and so forth. Allah meaning God again, right? Just means God. And again, this is an individual duty. Bin Laden's words, quote, "the duty of every Muslim in this world," unquote. He references the verse of the sword that I brought up in relation to Faraj. Um, he does note the various forms of jihad, right? In addition to military fighting, they can fight with their wealth, pens, tongues, and themselves. I guess volunteering in various ways. But all of it, channeled towards this end of expelling the enemy, defeating the godless powers that be. Right. The method of warfare is to be, as he puts it, guerrilla warfare. It's the only kind of warfare that they could use, right? I mean, they don't have a national army, any kind of actual engagement with conventional armies in the West, the United States, would obviously be a losing proposition. So guerrilla warfare, but this is kind of a euphemism, in his case, for terrorism, right? Which he defends a little obliquely, but pretty clearly at one point in the statement as, quote, "a legitimate and moral duty," unquote. Terrorism is a legitimate and moral duty. He uses the term terrorizing, which is a little more vague than terrorism, but that's what's going on with the guerrilla warfare. One more thing I'll point out in this statement, this declaration of war against Americans, is his contrast of what he considered to be American weakness and cowardice with the toughness of the Mujahideen, right? Often been U.S. presidents have referred to these kind of terrorist attacks that he was already engaged in as acts of cowards. Terrorism was a cowardly enterprise by people who weren't willing to face up to, actually fighting military people, for example. And bin Laden wants to turn this on its head and say, one thing that they like to say, he doesn't say that here, often jihadists like to say that the Mujahideen love death more than you love life, right? More than you Westerners in particular. You always trying to survive, but we love death because, death means going to paradise. We die as martyrs. We're going to go straight to paradise. So, so we're not afraid of death at all. We're eager for it. We seek it. So who's the real cowards, right? He also, another place he called the United States a weak horse, which is kind of a equivalent of what we call a paper tiger. He probably underestimated the response the U.S. would have to 9/11. But in another sense, he may not have totally gotten it wrong. He thought that in the long run, Americans didn't have a stomach for a long war, and that may in fact be true. Whether a long war is needed in the sense of an all-out war, that's another question. But so their perspective, the jihadist perspective, is we are actually weak. We're decadent. We're caught up in little trivial affairs. We're concerned with staying alive so we can pursue our little creature comforts and so forth. But we are striving for paradise. Um, in terms of Bin Laden's legacy, of course, the biggest thing is that he globalized jihad. Um, you could say that Islam, um, by Islamists, had already been deterritorialized, is a word that's used for it. And deculturated is also used. Deterritorialized meaning, Islam historically it's had taken many different forms in many different cultural contexts, right? Which color and flavor it and make it concrete. Um, and so Islam has a lot of variety historically, but they're sort of taking Islam out of those particular context and seeing it as sort of this abstract thing, which is going to be applied sort of mechanically without regard to culture and so forth, by people who will accept and impose the Islamic State, right? So it's deculturated, deterritorialized. That had already been sort of a tendency in Islamist thought, Islamism, right? Um, and Islamists like Qutb had pointed ahead to, a worldwide overthrowing of non-Muslim systems, but he and others had conceived of this as a prospect in the far-off future, maybe generations, right? Bin Laden, the global jihad is on now, right? This worldwide revolution, overthrowing the regimes, and so forth. It's on now. Doesn't go as far as ISIS saying we're actually going to establish some Islamic states now. The main thing now was to um, to resist these godless powers that be, right? Another important part of his legacy is Bin Laden's mastery of propaganda. I mean, he did have a way with words. His images was um, very public. He became kind of an icon, an inspiration for potential recruits, right? And I mean, the kind of media he was using was fairly primitive, but he used it very effectively. That has become um, a very important development in jihadism. You see people like groups like ISIS, very what's the word? Sophisticated use of technology. People using social media, all kinds of graphics, uh, computer graphics, very slick internet websites, slick publications, and so forth. Um, this this, but Bin Laden was kind of the pioneer here, and and all of this is very important in appealing to the youth, right? It's the youth who are into social media and into the internet and into all of this, high tech gadgetry and so forth, and and this is a very powerful recruitment tool, and they're aiming at. Bin Laden says it in this fatwa, this declaration of war. Um, he directly singles out the youth. I'm appealing to you, you young people, um, to lead the cause, right? And then there were the Al Qaeda spinoffs. I mentioned before there was Al Qaeda Central, as we came to call it, where Bin Laden and Zawahiri, in particular, those two. Zawahiri was a doctor from Egypt. Um, they were sort of the nerve center, if you will, in an organization, a network that was increasingly decentralized, where where various groups, sleeper cells, and so forth were operating, almost independently of Al Qaeda Central. but they were sort of um, the ultimate planners and what's the term, authorizers, in the sense that they would sometimes they do it after the fact, but they would say, they would bless certain cause, certain efforts, certain attacks, and so forth. And when they gave it their seal of approval, that was sort of carried a lot of weight in the jihadist world. Um, but then you had what is often called franchises, kind of like McDonald's, where all these different McDonald's managers, like, they own their own, they own their McDonald's enterprise, but they operate according to the way that corporate has laid down in terms of all the rules you should follow, and how you cut the fries, and how long you fry it, and so forth. Um, there was a similar phenomenon with again, it's a very decentralized structure, and you had all these groups sort of semi-autonomous, sometimes pretty much completely autonomous, and you ended up with a ton of splinter groups, if you will. So just to mention a few of them, there was Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Oh, these are actually, these are major affiliates. Al Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is a part of Africa. Al Shabaab, which is also in Africa. Al Qaeda in the Caucasus in Russia. Al Qaeda in Gaza. Al Qaeda in Kurdistan. Al Qaeda in Lebanon, etc., etc. Right, and there are other groups who are believed to be affiliates of Al Qaeda, and so you got a few dozen at least. And one of these was one of the spin-offs, which are no longer formally associated with Al Qaeda, but one of the spin-offs was ISIS. This group ISIS. It originally started in Iraq. Some of the people who came over, some of the jihadists who came over and were attacking U.S. troops and so forth, and causing chaos in Iraq after the U.S. invasion in 2003. There was a group led by a guy named Zarqawi, Zarqawi in English, not to be confused with Zawahiri. Zawahiri was, one of the leaders in Al Qaeda Central with Bin Laden. Zarqawi was this fighter, known, famous, or infamous for being incredibly brutal in his methods of killing people and so forth. And he led up this group that the U.S. came to call Al Qaeda in Iraq, because he was Zarqawi was affiliated with Al Qaeda, and his base of operations was Iraq. And eventually, this spin out. There was a tension between Zarqawi and Bin Laden, because actually Bin Laden was telling Zarqawi he was being too brutal, to the point that it was turning people off, and giving the jihadists a bad reputation. As Bin Laden's kind of cool head in the room here, but Zarqawi kind of has a break with Al Qaeda Central, and eventually it becomes its own separate group headed by this guy al-Baghdadi, right? But ISIS has become the sort of new trendsetter, the new icon, and you could developing what you could call jihad chic. I mean, they start trying to make jihad cool. And you see all these images of young fighters, holding their machine guns and so forth, striking cool poses and stuff, because they're just trying to appeal to a sense of adventure and a sense of heroism, and just this is cool. This is a really cool activity. You should join up. There's a lot of this, and ISIS is very good at this. And this is, in the literature, scholarly literature, when they look at motivations of of people who fight, this is a very common one given. A desire for heroism and a desire for adventure and that kind of thing. Really, if you think about it, I mean, if you sort of buy into the ideology, um, you could understand the logic of the appeal. That okay, so I'm gonna, I have a sort of mediocre life here, maybe hard times or whatever, and I'm gonna join this group, and have a sense of belonging in the group, and um, I'm gonna risk my life, but if I die fighting, I'm a hero. Plus, I go straight to heaven, you know, and have the 72 virgins, and so forth. This was one controverted interpretation of a verse of the Quran, but um, this is heady stuff, right? I can be a hero. I can be a hero for Islam and the triumph of Islam around the world, and the victory of Islam in this cosmic battle against these forces of evil, and you know, all my problems are solved, and I'm forgiven for all my sins, and I go straight to heaven. What's not to like? Anyway, going down to elements of ideology in Bin Laden to sum up. Um, One of the terms that he mentions a lot, you see this a lot in jihadist literature, is humiliation. We have been humiliated, right? You think about that long background of defeats um, in um, in Islamic history after an initial beginning when Islam was first founded of conquest, victory after victory. It looked like never lose. A sense of triumphalism develops, and you combine that with a tribal culture in many of these places, which is heavily built on honor and shame, and you have the ingredients for intense feelings of humiliation by people who feel like the Muslim world is being stepped on, is being, it's become a backwater, in terms of progress, and they're just being dominated over by these arrogant Westerners and so forth. And that sense of humiliation is something often appealed to. I think it kind of goes with that initial motivation of wanting a sense of humiliation. That kind of shame is very powerful. It's hard to live with that, and this is a great way out. I can assert myself. I can show that I can show those guys that I'm on top, right? Um, there's a hope of paradise, right? I mean, if you die, if you're martyred, there's an afterlife, in addition to being a hero and so forth. Um, if you live, or if you die, you're working towards this Islamic state. You're helping to pave the way for that. But it's a form of escapism. This is an element of ideology that we've noticed again and again, right? Escapism. You escape from, above all, from what a German novelist Doderer called the highly concrete task of dealing with concrete problems of your life, right? Above all, the problems with yourself. It's a handy escapism from all that. So I've got this utopia. I'm going to engage in this project, and I can get away from all those problems. I don't have to solve all those problems. I don't have to wrestle with my own issues because this is my ticket. Um, that element of self-assertion, radical self-assertion, the will to triumph and dominate, right? Again, what Vogelin pointed us to, the libido dominandi, the lust for domination, which is not only to dominate the infidel, but to dominate the whole, this whole reality that's been oppressing me, and so I create this second reality, as Vogelin talks about it. That's kind of the ideology. I'm going to create a whole new imaginary world. I'm going to live within that world, and part of this world is this utopian end. Part of it is a sort of making ourselves, you know, um, part of the pure, the chosen people, or whatever. And then a part of it is this demonization of them, right? So you starkly divide the world in between a chosen people on one side and demons on the other, right? And the imperative of cleansing the world. Bin Laden uses the term here in his statement again. cleansing the land of those occupiers, he says. Cleansing is famous words of purifying ourselves from all of this, these evils of the world, and everything that's plaguing us. We'll wipe it all out, right? And so the deeper motivation seems to be kind of self-salvation, saving ourselves from this crappy world that we've been stuck with. Okay, that's it for Bin Laden and for Islamism. I'm going to give one more short lecture on um, a kind of course wrap up. What to take away from the course as a whole, and I'll see you then shortly. We'll finish up with that.